Chapter 2: The Secret Keepers and the Silk Code. The paradox of an empire built on thread. When we envision the geopolitical might of the ancient Chinese empires, our minds are naturally drawn to monuments of staggering physical scale. We picture the Great Wall, a serpentine dragon of stone and packed earth snaking across the desolate northern mountains, built to keep the nomadic cavalry at bay. We imagine the terracotta army, an endless, silent legion of clay soldiers buried in the earth to protect the first emperor in the afterlife. We think of armored generals, imperial decrees, and the gleaming steel of halberds. History, as it is traditionally written, is an inventory of masculine conquests, monumental architecture, and the blunt application of force. But if you look closer, past the stonemasonry and the bronze weaponry, you will find the true foundation of Chinese imperial stability. It was not made of stone, nor was it forged in iron. It was a microscopic, nearly invisible protein filament. The geopolitical and economic dominance of the Han, Tang, and Song dynasties rested almost entirely on a single, astonishingly complex agricultural and manufacturing process. And this process was the absolute, undisputed domain of women. This is the story of how the ancient Asian world was engineered not by emperors or generals, but by the women who worked in the steaming courtyards and shadowed workshops of the empire. These women were the biological managers of a delicate species. They were the intuitive physicists who mastered the precise thermodynamics of boiling water. They were the microengineers who spun invisible filaments into an unbreakable currency. They were the original keepers of the Silk Code. To understand the magnitude of their achievement, we must first strip away the myth that silk was merely a luxury textile, a soft, shimmering fabric meant to drape the shoulders of aristocrats. In the ancient world, silk was not just clothing. It was power. It was the most stable macroeconomic currency in the world. It was the ultimate diplomatic leverage. And for thousands of years, it was the most tightly guarded, fiercely protected technological secret in the history of human civilization. The ultimate trade secret. Imagine a product so desirable, so universally coveted, that entire foreign empires would drain their treasuries just to acquire a handful of it. In the 1st century of the Common Era, the Roman Empire developed an insatiable, almost pathological obsession with Chinese silk. When the first bolts of this luminous, impossibly soft fabric made their way across the perilous overland trade routes of Central Asia, they arrived in the Mediterranean world like artifacts from another dimension. The Romans had mastered wool, which was heavy, scratchy, and dull. They had mastered linen, which was stiff and prone to wrinkling. But this new fabric flowed like liquid light. It was cool to the touch in the sweltering heat of the Mediterranean summer, yet it trapped warmth during the winter. It caught the dye of the precious Tyrian purple in a way that made the color seem to glow from within. The Roman aristocracy was instantly captivated. Patrician women and men alike began donning silk garments, parading through the forum in translucent, shimmering robes. But this new fashion came at a catastrophic cost. Because the overland journey from the Chinese capital of Chang'an to the markets of Rome spanned thousands of miles of hostile deserts, towering mountain ranges, and bandit-infested territories, the fabric passed through the hands of dozens of middlemen. By the time a bolt of silk reached the shores of the Mediterranean, its price had inflated to astronomical proportions. It was literally worth its weight in gold. The Roman Senate panicked. The empire's gold and silver reserves were hemorrhaging eastward to pay for this luxury. Prominent statesmen and philosophers took to the Senate floor to denounce the fabric. Seneca the Younger, the Stoic philosopher, complained bitterly about the moral decay brought on by silk. He famously lamented that he could see women walking the streets in clothes that hid neither their bodies nor their decency. But neither moral outrage nor economic anxiety could stem the tide of demand. The Romans had to have silk. Yet, for all their military might and engineering prowess, the Romans were entirely ignorant of how this miraculous fabric was made. The great Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, an encyclopedic compiler of ancient knowledge, confidently asserted that silk was harvested from the downy leaves of trees in the mysterious eastern land of Serica. Other classical scholars theorized that it was a type of fine earth, or perhaps the byproduct of some strange, desert-dwelling spider. They were utterly, hopelessly wrong. The ignorance of the Roman world was not an accident. It was the result of a highly sophisticated, state-sponsored regime of information control enacted by the Chinese emperors. Long before the concept of intellectual property or patent law existed, the Chinese state recognized that its absolute monopoly on silk production was the cornerstone of its geopolitical power. To protect this monopoly, the state implemented a set of laws so draconian, so uncompromising, that they make modern corporate non-disclosure agreements look like polite suggestions. We can call this framework the Silk Code. The laws of the empire explicitly forbade the exportation of any biological material related to sericulture. It was illegal to take a living silkworm out of the country. It was illegal to transport silkworm eggs. It was even illegal to smuggle the seeds of the white mulberry tree, the specific plant required to feed the silkworms. The enforcement of these laws was absolute, and the punishment for violating them was terrifyingly simple: death. Border guards were stationed at every major pass along the western frontier. Every caravan, every merchant, and every traveler seeking to leave the empire was subjected to meticulous, invasive searches. The guards rifled through saddlebags, unpacked crates of ceramics, and interrogated travelers, desperate to ensure that the microscopic secrets of the empire remained safely within its borders. The Chinese state understood that if the biological raw materials ever fell into the hands of foreign powers, the monopoly would shatter, and the empire's greatest economic weapon would be neutralized. For centuries, this lethal deterrent worked flawlessly. But no monopoly, regardless of how violently it is defended, can endure forever against the relentless pressure of human greed and ingenuity. History records several legendary breaches of the Silk Code, moments of high-stakes industrial espionage that slowly unraveled the empire's absolute control. The most romanticized of these breaches occurred in the Tarim Basin, involving the ancient kingdom of Khotan. According to historical anecdotes passed down through generations of Buddhist monks, a Chinese princess was arranged to be married to the king of Khotan to secure a political alliance. The princess, accustomed to the finest luxuries of the imperial court, could not bear the thought of living out her days in a foreign land without the comfort of her silk garments. She knew the border guards would search her luggage, her attendants, and her carriages, but she also knew that they would never dare to touch the royal personage herself. In an act of supreme treason against her homeland, the princess acquired viable silkworm eggs and the seeds of the white mulberry tree. She carefully concealed the microscopic contraband deep within the elaborate, towering folds of her bridal headdress. When her procession reached the heavily fortified border crossing, the guards conducted their thorough inspections, but they bowed their heads respectfully as the princess passed, entirely unaware that the most valuable technological secret in the world was hidden within her hair. She successfully smuggled the biological foundation of the silk industry to Khotan, breaking the absolute geographic containment of the empire. A far more devastating breach occurred centuries later, in the mid-6th century. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern successor to Rome, was exhausted from decades of warfare with the Sassanid Persian Empire. The Persians sat directly across the Silk Road, acting as hostile middlemen who controlled the flow of silk into the Byzantine capital of Constantinople. Whenever hostilities flared, the Persians simply severed the trade routes, plunging the Byzantine economy into chaos and depriving the imperial court of its most essential luxury. Emperor Justinian I, ruling from Constantinople, was determined to break this Persian stranglehold. He needed a domestic silk industry. Around the year 552, Justinian recruited 2 Nestorian Christian monks who had traveled extensively in the East. He offered them an immense fortune if they could accomplish the impossible: infiltrate the heart of the silk-producing regions, steal the biological secret, and bring it back to Europe. The monks embarked on an espionage mission that spanned thousands of miles and several years. Operating deep within hostile territory, they successfully acquired living silkworm eggs. To transport them, they hollowed out the centers of their bamboo walking canes, creating a perfectly concealed, temperature-controlled incubator. Carrying the fate of empires in their walking sticks, the monks braved the harsh deserts of Central Asia, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and evaded the relentless inspections of border guards. When the monks finally returned to Constantinople and presented the viable eggs to Emperor Justinian, the global monopoly of the East was irrevocably broken. The Byzantines quickly established their own state-run silk factories in cities like Beirut, Antioch, and Thebes. But here is the vital, often overlooked truth of the matter. Even after the biological secret was stolen, even after the Byzantine and Arab worlds began cultivating their own silkworms, Chinese silk remained the most sought-after, highly valued textile on Earth. Why? Because the true secret of Chinese silk was never just the biological existence of the worm. The true secret was the staggering, multi-generational accumulation of scientific knowledge, manual dexterity, and intuitive engineering possessed by the Asian women who manufactured it. The Byzantines had stolen the hardware, but the software, the tacit, embodied genius required to transform a cocoon into a flawless thread, remained firmly in the hands of the women of the East. The biological machine. To appreciate the scale of this female engineering, we must first look at the biological machine that made it all possible, the Bombyx mori silkworm. This creature was not a wild animal simply captured and exploited by humans. It was a highly specialized, genetically engineered organism, selectively bred by generations of female agriculturalists over thousands of years. Through meticulous observation and selective breeding, these early women guided the evolution of the wild silk moth into a domesticated marvel. The resulting insect was entirely dependent on human intervention for its survival. It was blind. It had lost the ability to fly. It possessed only two driving instincts: to consume massive quantities of white mulberry leaves and to spin its cocoon. In exchange for surrendering its independence, the Bombyx mori developed a hypertrophied silk gland capable of producing a single, continuous filament of staggering length, often measuring between 600 and 1,500 meters long. That is nearly a mile of continuous thread, produced by a creature no larger than your index finger. The rearing of these silkworms was an exercise in extreme biological management. The worms were incredibly fragile. They were susceptible to slight fluctuations in temperature. They could be killed by drafts. They were so sensitive to their environment that the women rearing them had to protect them from loud noises, strong odors, and even the smell of human sweat. For weeks on end, the women of the household would sleep in shifts, feeding the ravenous caterpillars fresh mulberry leaves every few hours, day and night, maintaining the exact hygienic and environmental conditions required to bring the worms to maturity. When the time finally came, the worm would anchor itself to a spinning frame and begin to extrude the silk. But the filament it produced was not a simple string. It was a complex composite biopolymer. The structural core of the thread is a highly crystalline protein called fibrin. This is the material that gives silk its immense tensile strength, rivaling that of modern steel wire of the same diameter and its characteristic, luminous sheen. However, as the worm spins, it coats this strong fibrin core in a second protein, a sticky, water-soluble glycoprotein called sericin. When the worm is spinning its cocoon, this sericin gum acts as a natural biological cement. As soon as it comes into contact with the air, it hardens, gluing the hundreds of thousands of microscopic loops of fibrin together into a rigid, impenetrable armor. This is the cocoon. It is a biological fortress, designed to protect the vulnerable pupa inside as it metamorphoses into a moth. And this is where the true engineering challenge begins. To harvest the silk, the women had to dismantle this biological fortress without breaking the mile-long filament. If the moth were allowed to hatch naturally, it would secrete an enzyme that burned a hole straight through the wall of the cocoon, cutting the continuous filament into thousands of useless, short fragments. Therefore, the cocoon had to be processed before the moth could emerge. But how do you unwind a thread that is glued solid by hardened sericin? You cannot simply pull it. The thread is only a fraction of a millimeter thick. If you pull a cold, hardened cocoon, the microscopic filament will snap instantly under the tension. The answer lay in a masterpiece of applied thermodynamics. The thermodynamics of reeling. The women of ancient Asia discovered that the sericin gum could be manipulated through the precise application of heat and water. In a process known as cocoon cooking, the hardened cocoons were submerged in basins of hot water. The heat was designed to initiate the hydrolytic decomposition of the sericin. In simple terms, the hot water melted the glue. But this was not a simple matter of tossing cocoons into a boiling pot. The women had to maintain an impossibly narrow thermodynamic envelope. The scientific reality of silk proteins is incredibly unforgiving. If the water in the basin was too cold, the saracen would remain hard, the cocoon would not soften, and the filament would break the moment the woman tried to pull it. But if the water was too hot, or if the cocoons were left in the heat for too long, disaster struck. Excessive thermal energy causes the saracen molecules to break down completely, destroying the molecular weight of the protein. The glue dissolves entirely, the structural integrity of the cocoon collapses, and the miles of thread instantly turn into a useless, tangled, unreelable mass of ruined silk. Modern polymer scientists, using digital thermometers, computerized thermostats, and chemical analysis, have determined that the absolute optimum condition for dissolving extracted saracen without degrading the underlying fibroin polymer is precisely 90 degrees Celsius, maintained for exactly 5 minutes. The women of the ancient courtyards did not have digital thermometers. They did not have thermostats. They did not have molecular mass spectrometers. They had charcoal fires, clay or metal basins, and their own finely tuned senses. Controlling the heat transfer rate was a matter of profound intuitive physics. The primary fuel was charcoal, chosen for its ability to produce a steady, intensely hot, and relatively smokeless fire. The women managed the temperature by manipulating the airflow to the braziers, opening and closing small vents, and adjusting the physical distance of the water basin from the heat source. They constantly stirred the water, ensuring a perfectly even distribution of thermal energy, so that the outer and inner layers of the cocoons softened at the exact same rate. To identify the exact temperature of the water without instruments, these female engineers developed a highly sophisticated visual and auditory lexicon based on the kinetics of boiling water. They watched the behavior of the submerged gases and the formation of bubbles with the intense focus of a master chemist. When the water first began to warm, reaching roughly 70 degrees Celsius, tiny, pinhead-sized bubbles would form on the bottom of the basin. The women called this stage shrimp eyes. They knew the water was still too cold to break the bonds of the saracen. As the heat increased to roughly 80 degrees, the bubbles expanded, and the first faint wisps of steam began to rise from the surface of the basin. This stage was called crab eyes. The outer layers of the saracen were just beginning to swell, absorbing the thermal energy. Then came the critical threshold. As the temperature approached the perfect window of 85 to 90 degrees Celsius, the bubbles grew to the size of small pearls, and the rising steam became thick and strong. The water would begin to emit a low, audible rumbling sound. The women called this stage fish eyes. This was the sweet spot. This was the exact thermodynamic balance where the saracen softened just enough to release its grip, but not enough to degrade the fiber. If the water progressed beyond this to a full, rolling boil, a stage known as a string of pearls, the risk of destroying the silk increased exponentially. The women had to constantly add small amounts of cold water, shift the coals, and fan the flames to keep the basin hovering perpetually in the fish eyes stage. But they did not rely on their eyes alone. The reeling courtyard was a deeply sensory environment. As the cocoons simmered in the hot water, the thermal energy effectively cooked the pupae sealed inside. This released a very distinct, slightly earthy, vaguely fishy odor of organic decay into the steam. The precise character of this smell, combined with the tactile sensation of the water itself, which grew thicker and more viscous as the dissolved saracen bled into the basin, told the reelers exactly when the cocoons were ready to be unwound. Microengineering and the human machine. Once the thermodynamic threshold was achieved, the process shifted from chemical engineering to extreme mechanical precision. Extracting the raw silk from the softened cocoon, the reeling process itself demanded a level of manual dexterity and sustained cognitive focus that borders on the superhuman. The exterior of a silkworm cocoon is not a neat, orderly spool of thread waiting to be pulled. It is covered in a chaotic, tangled web of broken and irregular fibers known as floss. Before the continuous, usable filament can be accessed, this unreelable exterior must be cleared away. While the cocoons bobbed in the scalding 90-degree water, The women used specialized brushes, often crafted from the fine, resilient roots of bamboo, to gently agitate the surfaces. This brushing had to be perfectly calibrated. Striking the cocoons too aggressively would snap the delicate fibroin core hidden beneath the floss. Brushing too lightly would leave behind microscopic tangles that would eventually foul the reeling thread, introducing catastrophic, lumpy defects into the finished textile. Through the rising steam and the murky, Saracen-thickened water, the reeler had to visually identify and manually isolate the true end of the continuous filament. Imagine trying to find the end of a roll of clear tape while blindfolded, and you begin to understand the difficulty. The wet silk filament possesses a diameter of roughly 0.025 millimeters. It is significantly thinner than a human hair, and when submerged in water, it is virtually transparent. Yet, through decades of accumulated tactile experience, the women could find the microscopic end with a flick of their bamboo brushes and the pinch of their calloused fingers. But finding the end was only the first step. A single strand of silk is far too fragile to be woven on a loom or used in daily commerce. Therefore, the reeler had to combine multiple microscopic filaments into a single, unified thread. Depending on the desired thickness of the final yarn, a measurement known as denier, the woman would gather anywhere from 5 to 20 individual cocoon filaments in her fingers. She guided this cluster of invisible threads upward, lifting them out of the steaming basin. As the filaments left the hot water and encountered the cooler ambient air of the workshop, physics intervened once again. The softened Saracen coating the outside of each strand rapidly cooled and hardened. In a fraction of a second, the Saracen acted as a natural bioadhesive, flash freezing the individual strands together, gluing them into a single, unified, unbreakable fiber. This composite thread was then passed through a tiny guide or eyelet, historically made of polished lac, smooth ceramic, or glass. This eyelet ensured that the filaments converged at a precise angle, minimizing friction and maintaining a perfect, continuous tension. From the eyelet, the thread traveled upward and was wrapped onto a wooden reeling wheel, known as a swift. The operator powered this reeling wheel using a wooden foot treadle, freeing both of her hands to manage the chaotic, high-stakes environment of the boiling basin. This is where the true ergonomic marvel of the female reeler becomes apparent. A single cocoon might unwind for 1,000 meters, but it would inevitably run out. Because the final woven fabric required a perfectly consistent thickness, the operator had to constantly monitor the diameter of the thread flying rapidly through her fingers. The moment she felt a drop in thickness, signaling that one of the cocoons in the basin was exhausted or its delicate filament had snapped, she had to react instantly. Without breaking her rhythm, without stopping the rapid pumping of the foot treadle, and without looking away from the spinning wheel, she had to dip her fingers back into the scalding water, isolate a new, invisible filament from a fresh cocoon, and cast it perfectly into the moving thread. She relied on the wet, sticky Saracen of the new strand to fuse seamlessly into the aggregate thread, moving at high speed toward the wheel. The female reeler operated as a biological sensor and an actuator. She simultaneously managed the thermodynamic state of the water, the rotational velocity of the wheel, the microscopic tension of the thread, and the rapid, continuous substitution of invisible fibers. To perform this sustained multitasking for 10 to 12 hours a day, in the sweltering heat of the summer reeling season, represents a zenith of pre-industrial manufacturing technique. It was a symphony of heat, water, biology, and human dexterity. The engine of an empire. The staggering technical achievements of these female reelers and weavers were not isolated acts of rural artisanship. They were not merely making pretty dresses for wealthy ladies at court. The silk they spun was the absolute macroeconomic bedrock of the Chinese Empire. While Western history books tend to focus on the gold and silver of the Roman and Mediterranean economies, the great dynasties of the East, particularly the Han and the Tang, operated on a fundamentally different financial architecture. For centuries, the most stable, reliable, and widely accepted currency in East Asia was not minted from metal. It was woven by women. During the Tang Dynasty, the state faced chronic, crippling shortages of precious metals. The official copper coinage was a disaster. The coins were frequently debased by counterfeiters, their face value lacked credibility, and they were physically too heavy and cumbersome to be used for the large-scale military and commercial transactions required to run an empire spanning millions of square miles. If a merchant wanted to buy an estate, or if the government needed to purchase 1,000 horses, attempting to pay in copper coins would require a fleet of heavy wagons just to transport the cash. To solve this macroeconomic crisis, the imperial government institutionalized female-produced silk as the standard, quantifiable medium of exchange. The women working in the rural households and the sprawling imperial workshops were not merely weaving cloth. They were literally minting the state's money. But to function as a currency, the silk had to be perfectly standardized. A currency is useless if its value fluctuates wildly from one region to the next. Therefore, monetary silk, a specific plain weave known as silk tabby, was woven to exact, legally mandated specifications. A standard bolt was precisely 12 meters in length and 54 centimeters in width. Every bolt had to meet strict weight and quality standards. These standardized bolts of female-produced silk became the lifeblood of the empire's fiscal policy. They were the primary medium for purchasing high-value goods. They were used to pay agricultural taxes. They were used to remunerate government officials and pay the salaries of the imperial army. They were used to purchase large tracts of land and settle massive commercial debts. The sheer scale of this shadow economy was staggering, but its most critical application was in the realm of national security and foreign policy. The northern borders of the Chinese Empire were constantly threatened by massive confederations of nomadic warriors, the Xiongnu during the Han Dynasty, and the Uyghurs and Turks during the Tang. These nomadic empires fielded vast armies of highly mobile, incredibly lethal light cavalry. Military conquest of the endless Eurasian steppe was often geographically impossible, logistically suicidal, and financially ruinous for the agrarian Chinese state. Instead, the emperors utilized the ultimate weapon, silk diplomacy. The imperial state extracted millions of bolts of silk from the female weavers through the national tax system. The state then used these textiles to effectively bribe nomadic warlords into peace treaties. The emperors would shower the chieftains of the steppe with tens of thousands of bolts of luxury silk, integrating them into a tributary system that prioritized economic appeasement over endless bloodshed. Furthermore, the empire desperately needed cavalry horses to defend itself against those same nomads. In the 8th century, under the reign of Emperor Daizong, Uyghur envoys routinely drove tens of thousands of horses from the northern steppes to the capital city of Chang'an, demanding exorbitant prices. The imperial court was furious, but they had no choice. They needed the horses to survive, and the Uyghurs did not want copper. They did not want silver. The exchange rate was rigidly, inflexibly set, 40 standard bolts of female-produced silk for a single warhorse. When we look back at the grand sweep of Asian history, we must adjust our perspective. The security of the Great Wall, the survival of the imperial court, and the projection of Chinese power did not rest solely on the shoulders of armor-clad generals or the brilliant strategies of male philosophers. The empire was underwritten by the calloused, burned, incredibly dexterous fingers of millions of women operating wooden looms. The famed Silk Road itself, the great artery of global commerce that connected the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea, was forged not by male merchants seeking adventure, but by the irresistible, gravitational pull of the currency these women produced. The exploitation and the spiritual power. Yet, despite their undeniable status as the economic engine of the ancient world, the women who produced the silk were subjected to brutal, systemic exploitation under the patriarchal structure of the state. The imperial government implemented a deeply flawed fiscal policy known as the two-tax system, which placed a crushing, relentless burden on the primary producers of textiles. Because the government demanded tax payments in the form of copper cash or standardized silk, corrupt bureaucrats routinely manipulated the conversion rates to line their own pockets. A local tax collector would artificially lower the estimated value of the silk when collecting taxes, claiming it was of inferior quality, thereby forcing the female weavers to surrender far more cloth than they legally owed to meet their quota. During periods of severe economic deflation, the market value of silk could plummet. A bolt that once traded for 4,000 units of copper might suddenly drop in value to a mere 800 units. but the state's tax demands remained rigidly static. This meant that the real, physical labor burden on the female weavers could increase 3 to 5 times over in a single year. These women were locked into a relentless, grueling cycle of production. They worked from before dawn until late into the night. They managed the precarious biological rearing of the worms. They endured the searing heat and the foul smells of the boiling basins. They suffered the backbreaking, repetitive labor of throwing the shuttle across the heavy wooden looms. And after all that profound physical and intellectual labor, they watched the wealth they generated be siphoned away by provincial governors, imperial tax collectors, and foreign warlords. It was a recurring tragedy of the silk trade that whenever the skill of textile production achieved high social status, or whenever it moved into lucrative, public, urban guilds, men frequently stepped in to take managerial control, relegating the women back to subaltern, unpaid domestic roles within the rural household. However, given the absolute existential importance of silk to the survival of the Chinese state, it is unsurprising that the profound technological mastery of these women could not be entirely erased. While the bureaucratic reality was one of endless taxation and exploitation, the cultural and spiritual reality acknowledged the sacred, life-giving nature of female sericulture. The foundational myth of the entire silk industry centers entirely on female genius. According to ancient lore, codified by philosophers such as Confucius, the discovery of silk was not the work of a male scholar or a wandering merchant. It is attributed to Leizu, the young empress and wife of the legendary Yellow Emperor, in the 27th century before the Common Era. The legend states that Empress Leizu was resting in an imperial garden, sitting in the shade of a white mulberry tree, sipping a cup of hot tea. Without warning, a silkworm cocoon dropped from the branches and fell directly into her steaming cup. As the hot liquid precisely performed the thermodynamic work of softening the Saracen gum, perfectly mimicking the 90-degree water of the modern reeling basin, the cocoon began to unravel. Rather than reacting with disgust and discarding the insect, the Empress's deeply curious mind recognized the structural potential of the shimmering filament. She reached into the hot tea, pinched the microscopic thread, and slowly unwound the cocoon. Marveling at its strength and luster, Leizu persuaded her husband to plant a massive grove of mulberry trees. She domesticated the silkworm, taught her female attendants how to rear them, and subsequently invented both the silk reeling wheel and the first weaving loom. Modern archaeological evidence reveals that silk production existed in China as early as the Yangshao culture in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, predating the mythological timeline of Empress Leizu by 1,000 years. But the historical accuracy of the teacup story is irrelevant. The legend's persistence across thousands of years of Chinese history is deeply significant because it formally encodes a societal understanding that sericulture was inherently, organically, and divinely female. For centuries, Empress Leizu was worshipped across the empire as the goddess of the silkworm. She represented ingenuity, serving as the patron deity of the textile arts. This mythological reverence translated into actual, tangible religious and social power for women at the local village level. In rural communities across northern China, the cult of the silkworm mother became a core, unshakable component of local community religion. Because the rearing of silkworms is such a highly sensitive, precarious biological process, the success of a silk harvest always felt fragile, subject to the whims of nature and divine intervention. Women took absolute, unquestioned charge of the spiritual and hygienic protocols of the rearing rooms. Mothers had a strict moral and cultural obligation to pass down the tacit, deeply complex knowledge of seri techniques to their daughters, creating an unbroken, matrilineal chain of technological and spiritual inheritance that stretched back to the dawn of civilization. In times of crisis, when a silk crop was failing due to disease, or when mysterious illnesses struck the village that traditional medicine could not cure, the villagers did not turn to the male Confucian scholars. They turned to female spirit mediums who channeled the ancient power of the silkworm mother. Thus, the mastery of the silkworm provided these women with a rare, culturally sanctioned space to exercise spiritual authority and communal leadership within a heavily patriarchal society. Their technical proficiency over the biology of the worm and the physics of the boiling basin elevated them to the status of healers, providers, and divine intermediaries. When we listen to the rhythmic clack of the loom, when we watch the shimmering thread wind around the wooden swift, we are witnessing the heartbeat of the ancient world. The history of the silk industry requires us to profoundly reevaluate what our society categorizes as technology and who we acknowledge as engineers. History has readily, eagerly bestowed these titles upon the men who designed aqueducts, the men who forged siege engines, and the men who drafted imperial tax codes. Yet, the Asian women who sustained the Chinese empire engaged in an industrial process that was arguably more complex, requiring an intuitive synthesis of biology, thermodynamics, chemistry, and extreme micromechanical precision. They were the original keepers of the Silk Code. They genetically engineered a wild, flying moth into a blind, biological factory. They mastered the applied thermodynamics required to hydrolyze protein gums without degrading the underlying polymers. They possessed the staggering manual dexterity required to isolate an invisible filament from a boiling basin, combining and casting microscopic threads in a continuous, high-speed manufacturing loop that would baffle modern machinery. While the emperors sat on raised thrones draped in heavy yellow silk, and while generals negotiated distant borders with nomadic tribes, the true, undeniable power of the state was being generated in the humid, steam-filled courtyards. The Asian women who tended the mulberry trees and worked the wooden foot treadles did not merely weave luxury garments for the wealthy. They spun the very fabric of the early global economy, engineering a magnificent empire, thread by microscopic thread. Their legacy stands as a monumental, awe-inspiring chapter in the history of human achievement, a testament to the quiet, unsung genius of the women who built the silk world.